As Pakistan awaits its election results, many are asking if this is going to be another 1970 moment. But what is the 1970 moment? Well, it's got to do with the 1970 elections, which I'll be exploring today in this episode of The Print Explorer. I came across a secret document written in 1961 by Pakistan's martial law ruler General Ayub Khan. And I wanted to read it out to you because it tells you something important. This was top secret. And it says, it would not be quite logical to say that the notion of Pakistan came into being only with the establishment of the country on the 14th of August 1947. Its roots go very deep into our history. In fact, it was a concept which evolved and emerged in the course of time as a result of the inevitable and unalterable forces of history. General Ayub Khan thought that Pakistan had to claim a legacy that spanned back to the Arab conquest of Sindh, to the great Mughal dynasties of India, and on to the present day, that it wasn't a country that began just with independence. Hi, I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a contributing editor at ThePrint. Thank you back to The Print Explorer. And thank you especially for the fabulous response you've given to earlier episodes of this program, which have led us to make it into a weekly show. I'm going to be taking a deep dive today into Pakistan's first ever free and fair general election with a universal franchise. That election happened in 1970, long after the independence of India and Pakistan, and with some consequences, I think, that are interesting today as we sit and watch new politicians, new leaders battle to become the next Prime Minister of Pakistan. I'll be talking a little bit about whether I think former Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is going to be the man who leads Pakistan, what the prospects of Imran Khan are. But once I've talked you through this 1970 election, which I think holds out some fascinating lessons about why Pakistan struggled and what Pakistan's national identity, that is questions of Islam, questions of culture, questions of geography, had to do with the making of its democratic destiny. So everyone says elections in Pakistan are a good thing. And that may broadly be true. Elections, democracy bring accountability, they help social plurality, they ensure that the people have a say in their collective vision, right? I mean, this is stuff we've been taught since day one. But in Pakistan, this wasn't quite the case. The very first election, the 1970 election, led, as we'll see today, to the disintegration of the country. It spurred on secessionism in what we today call Bangladesh, and it left some deep fractures that the country still struggles with today. So I want to start the program today by looking at two maps, and this is the first one. This, which we've taken or put together thanks to GeoTV, shout out to you guys, thank you for your hard work. You'll see it divides Pakistan into three sort of huge blocks. There's this wash of red up north. So that's all of Imran Khan's winning seats in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and in the very sort of northern end of Punjab. You'll see then a big swathe where former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's party, the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz Sharif faction, PMLN, has a stronghold, and then a third block of seats in the south of the country where the Pakistan People's Party is particularly strong. That tells us something interesting because as we saw from that 1961 document, Pakistan always saw it as necessary to create one country bound together by religion rather than let what it thought were fissiparous forces, that is, regional identity or language, tear it apart. But as we can see, we have three countries here. The political parties that claim to speak for political Islam and for a country built around the principles of political Islam and the Sharia are nowhere there. And this isn't new. So even in the 2000 2018 elections, if you look at the last map, sure, Imran Khan had a few more seats in Punjab, and that was with the backing of the army. But this sort of federalization of politics in the country by region, very, very marked. Now look at this map, this of Pakistan after the 1970 elections. The West is kind of divided into two blocks, the black and the red, that's the Awami National Party and the Pakistan People's Party, the PPP. But really it's one party because a lot of those seats for black going to areas which are very, very disproportionately large geographically compared to their population size. So you have this PPP country, if you like, in the West, Pakistan, and in the East, Pakistan, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's Awami League, the party of Bengali nationalism, completely dominating the picture there. And we know what happened next, right? The country fell apart. So how did the election lead to the death of a nation? Two important things happened on the eve of those elections in 1970, which we need to sort of keep in our mind. And one was that circumstance, God, fate, call it what you like, was not kind on Pakistan's rulers. There was a terrible cyclone on the eve of the elections in what was then East Pakistan, which, just according to official estimates, killed over 200,000 people, affected more than 3 million people, destroyed 90% of the crops and houses in a 3,000 square mile area. Hundreds of miles of agricultural land were simply washed away because of this epic cyclone. And of course, responsibility lay in many places for this disaster. The federal government, which was West Pakistan dominated, hadn't done enough and badly botched relief and rehabilitation work, which Bengali nationalists were right in condemning. But there was also incompetence and failure by the largely ethnic Bengali bureaucrats of East Pakistan, which wasn't talked about so much. But anyway, this cyclone gave a deep sort of spur to Bengali nationalism, and for the first time led Pakistan to think very seriously about what might happen if there was secession from the country, and whether two Pakistans would not lead to 3, 4, 5 Pakistans. And the second unhappy circumstance was the spluttering economy. And I have some figures here from papers written at the time. Though the economy showed a relatively healthy aggregate growth of 5.8% in 69-70 over 68-69, this wasn't something that was translating into the lives of ordinary people. There was just a 3.2% increase in per capita income because GDP growth was compensated by population and other factors. And even worse, inflation outpaced the growth of per capita income, which meant that people were actually hurting economically. Despite the 1965 war, there was declining foreign aid, and there were a lot of labor troubles which had started mounting, agitations, troubles that had begun generating a lot of sentiment against the military ruler, General Ayub Khan. The third 5-year plan, which ran from 65 to 70, had created a lot of expectations that Pakistan would do very well. Especially there was, like we had our Green Revolution in India, they had a Green Revolution, which had brought prosperity to many areas in Punjab. But the kind of growth you would have expected in industry, in the public sector wasn't there. And in urban areas, that was causing a lot of resentment and hardship. So problems on the national identity front, and problems on the economic front. And to understand these two problems ahead of the 1970 elections, you have to go back a little bit to look at why they hadn't had an election until then in the first place, a general election. Well, the first problem was something called East-West parity. See, Pakistan at that point, a country made up of two halves, thousands of kilometers away from each other. The problem was that the east of the country had a larger population than the west of the country. And if you had genuine electoral democracy, the eastern wing of the country would always have dominated. But Pakistan was really formed by, in reality and also in perception, by people who formed the elite of the western wing. That is the landed peasantry of Punjab, the big families of Sindh, plus this sort of elite in Karachi, either people with educational capital who went after partition, or big business people and tycoons. Um, the solution to keeping, or the means that was found to keep the East Pakistan public out, was that they had a provision in 1953 called the One Unit Plan. So the country was made up of two blocks, the East and the West. The provinces inside West Pakistan were dissolved, and they had a single entity called West Pakistan, which would have parity. The idea was compared to East Pakistan. The second element of this strategy was to ensure the status quo remained entrenched. So General Ayub Khan's regime, which which came into power just a few years after independence, initiated a much talked about program of land reform. But the historian Aisha Jalal tells us that agricultural lands in Punjab and Sindh remained concentrated in the hands of just a few large landlords. 80 feudal families, 80 feudal extended families dominated the country's resources, which obviously retarded its growth into any kind of modern democratic polity. A land reform commission was set up. It was formed by the military regime, and it underlined the need to eradicate feudalistic elements. The eradication of feudalism, of course, a necessary step before you can have a modern industrial economy or a modern agricultural economy for that matter. The commission, though, also called for, and I quote now, minimum necessary disturbance of the social edifice. So what did that mean? That meant, firstly, very limited land reforms. These, big holdings of thousands of hectares remained in place. And the final element was something General Ayub brought in, very dear to his heart, called basic democracy. Now, what was basic democracy and how did it differ from proper democracy? Well, General Ayub's constitution, he promulgated in 1962, thought of an electoral college for the National Assembly and the two provincial legislatures, that is West Pakistan and East Pakistan. Now, these legislatures weren't to be directly elected by voters. These basic democrats were basically bodies of people represented from the village level upwards who would then vote for representation at the national level. And obviously, though this basic democrat scheme was implemented and these elections did take place, they had polling in 1964 and then presidential and assembly elections in 1965. These elections didn't really yield a representative government in any meaningful sense, because in the absence of a genuine mass mandate, this was basically a prescription for assemblies run by the martial law regime. And furthermore, and that's exactly what these basic democrats did, they basically rubber stamped General Ayub's policies and said, whatever the military was doing was fantastic and great. And so much of this reform didn't really, go anywhere. The first basic democrat election, by the way, was held in December 1959. And martial law had continued after that, so the basic Democrats basically only legitimized General Ayub being in power. Later on, they started concentrating on the local government role. But even after 1964 and 1965, they didn't really assert themselves in questions of policy. Now, General Ayub was also seen as a secularizer, a reformer. He did a lot, for example, to bring in progressive laws outlawing marriages of women at a very young age. He did a lot for the rights of women. But I think it's misguided to think of Ayub as a secularist. I'll talk a little bit more about this. But Ayub understood, I think, that he needed some ideology to hang this sort of program of modernization and authoritarian control on. And that's why you'll recall the document I started off by talking about Pakistani history for a long time in the past. That's why he felt it so important to have a new national history that reached for Pakistan's roots in the dawn of Islam, There were many elements to his constitution also which acknowledged the supremacy of Islam. It said that no laws repugnant to the Sharia could be passed. So this Islamization, sort of legitimization by Islamization, was very much a part of Ayub's fabric. Even if the general loved whiskey and seemed to be a social progressive, he was accommodating some of the demands as an Islamist, seeing them as being religion as being a necessary building block of the country. And this was going to be something that had very big consequences, given the sort of unformed democracy that built up till 1970. Now, I'm not going to enumerate all the many reasons for the downfall of Ayub. Historians have put forward many factors. Notably, Ayub launched and then lost the war of 1965 with India. Of course, Pakistanis weren't told how disgracefully the Pakistani military had performed in that war. They were given a very different sort of spin on events. But I think, certainly there was a loss of prestige of the military. People had been told they would be sitting in Kashmir, and instead they, next thing you knew, they were battling to save Pakistan cities. There was the corruption of Ayub and his, immediate coterie that became another big issue as the economy deteriorated. And there was a sort of, growing sort of sense that economically things, Pakistan wasn't doing as well as it should have done, and that it was time for Ayub to go. Furthermore, there were growing complaints in Bengal of discrimination and unequal treatment. Finally, Ayub stepped aside and handed power to General Yahya Khan. It was, if you like, coup by the military itself against a serving incumbent with a new one coming in. And this new president, General Yahya Khan, moved very quickly to restore order and try and sort out some of the fundamental problems facing the country. Of course, Yahya's immediate declaration of martial law, full-blown martial law, had a pretty sobering effect on people who were still demonstrating on the streets against Ayub. These urban groups that had spearheaded the protests were shut up quite quickly by the risk of armed action by the army. And then Yahya Khan sort of made a big show of going after corrupt civil servants from General Ayub's period. Several hundred, I think some 303 civil servants of various ranks were suspended and then removed from government. And then there were a lot of new measures announced by Yahya for sorting out industrial discontent and labor unrest. Throughout the martial law period, General Yahya, who now has a very ugly reputation as the butcher of Bangladesh and as a debauch, a little more on that later, but maintained touch with people for the first time in Pakistan's history quite directly. He used to give radio broadcasts to the nation, sort of, I think, modeled on American President Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats to the nation, this warmer, cuddly general. The martial law administration had not banned political parties as was done in 1958, nor did it, try and shut the political class down altogether. Open political activity was temporarily restricted but resumed on January the 1st, 1970, following an announcement by General Yahya that he would hold Pakistan's first universal general election. This announcement was made in October 1969, quite soon after Yahya came to power. And in that same speech, Yahya announced that there would be two other very, very important decisions. First, the one unit of West Pakistan would be dissolved. So it would go back to being these various provinces. Pretty much the same ones we have today: Sindh, Punjab, Balochistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And second, this new parliamentary body that would come out of these elections was going to be based on population, not on parity between the two wings. And this was a pretty radical step because he was basically saying that, look, we acknowledge that we have not given East Pakistan recognition of the fact that the majority of the population is Bengali, ethnic Bengali, but we're going to do that. We're going to have universal suffrage, or what we call one man, one vote.
And prior to assuming and governing legislative functions, the new National Assembly would be given 120 days to draft a constitution, a proper constitution, to replace the one General Ayub had brought in. If it did it, great, but if they failed to achieve this target, then fresh elections would be held. And Yahya also said that provincial elections would be held too in these sort of disaggregated West Pakistan. But though he later decided that he wasn't going to do provincial elections until things had settled down after the national elections. So, in fact, General Yahya gave a very interesting comment about this in one meeting. He said, "I am myself frightened of my own blind power." Right? Quite a fascinating thing. He said, "I'm keen to get the country back on the rails of democracy because I'm frightened of my own power." And clearly here was a general acknowledging what his predecessor would not and what the institution would not, which was saying that, look, I'm just because I wear a uniform and I have 4 stars on my shoulder doesn't mean that I'm a repository of all wisdom and knowledge. It doesn't mean that I can guide my nation's destiny. So let's get back to those divisions we were talking about. Empowered by nationalist rhetoric charging Ayub with treachery, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto fought the elections of 1970 in a Mao cap and a green jacket, the first signifying socialism and the second Islam. Zulfikar vowed, "We shall wage a jihad for the cause of Islam, not only in Pakistan but anywhere in the world if required. If Muslim blood is being shed mercilessly in India, you cannot just wring your hands." So he tried to bring Islam to unify the nation. He also talked a lot about socialism. But there was a problem. And that problem was called Bangladesh, East Pakistan then. See, General Ayub had launched this project of Islamizing the Bengalis with great pomp, and he constantly reminded Bengalis of the great privations they'd allegedly gone through at the hands of Hindus for centuries immemorial. The Bengali language was systematically undermined. It had been accepted as a national language in 1956, but Urdu was promoted, which would be a big reason for the sparking off of protests. And ulema, religious clerics, were appointed in government-run primary schools to teach Islamic subjects. And the appointment of Bengali Hindus as teachers was discouraged. In 1965, Ayub Khan even issued an order saying that East Pakistan's history was to be rewritten to contrast the successes of Bengali Muslims with the weakness and effeteness of the Hindus. However, the Bengalis weren't really interested in this revivalist Islam or political Islam. The Awami League as a party captured their imagination, and the grievances and demands for provincial autonomy came to center stage. When the election results came in for 1970, as we'll see, something terrible happened which neither Yahya nor Zulfikar Ali Bhutto had expected, which is that the Awami League got a near totality of votes in East Pakistan. And given that West Pakistan was fractured between two parties, as we saw in that map, given that there were multiple parties, multiple regions, regional identities, the country's future was set to be guided by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Bhutto was just not willing to accept that, and he dug his heels in. That then led on to acts of violence. First, the Jamaat-e-Islami and its allies set up militias together with the Pakistan army to hunt down Bengali nationalists and members of the Hindu minority. In retaliation, of course, as you all know, a militia called the Mukti Bahini was set up, which then would go on to fight with Indian troops for the liberation of Bangladesh. That election, the single issue that rose in East Pakistan to the surprise of the West, binding it together, was a little bit, I can only compare it to the election held, which, led with tragic consequences in Bengal in 1945-1946, where the Muslims of northern India voted on the single issue of Pakistan. And now here was, another, this time Bengali Nationalist Party campaigning on the single issue of Bengali identity and its representation. And of course, that terrible cyclone in 1970 and economic stagnation all contributing. The Awami League, just to give you a sense, in the seats that it contested in the National Assembly, its votes ran from 60% to as high as 90% of votes cast, and there wasn't a single close contest, let alone a defeat for the Awami League. Mujib himself won both his seats, won by a margin of 60 votes to 1. That's staggering. Uh, Eventually, the seat Mujib surrendered was won unopposed by his economic advisor. So what happened after the 1970 elections? Well, I've told you about Zulfikar digging his heels in. And Zulfikar, for a man who was a socialist and at least a certain kind of Pakistani progressive, has turned into somewhat as a saint, was a little bit of a hawk. So before the 1960 war, he'd been a big advocate of confrontation with India. He'd wanted to incite rebellion from northeast to Punjab. And he'd pandered to Ayub Khan's sort of delusions of greatness. Zulfikar used to, constantly tell Ayub Khan that Hindu India couldn't stand up to a blow or two. And fears raised by General Muhammad Musa that, this great plan for 65 wouldn't go very well had been brushed aside by Ayub because of Zulfikar's insistence. And when the war was lost, Zulfikar blamed America, he blamed incompetent or dithering generals, everyone except himself for his role. And Ayub, in one, I found fascinating interaction with Mumtaz Bhutto, his cousin. Ayub Khan later told him, "Your cousin is a madman, don't follow him." But of course, Ayub Khan had followed Zulfikar to the brink of disaster. And the 1970 elections, he again, as another military ruler, Yahya Khan, chose to be overwhelmed by what was happening in the West and refused to recognize the election results. Of course, in this next election in 1970, after this election and the decisive Awami League victory, General Yahya Khan panicked as well and listened to the madman yet again, with tragic consequences for Pakistan. Now, I'm not going to get into the war and its tragic fallout. We all know that Pakistan lost the war and that it cost General Yahya Khan military rule, and that Zulfikar Bhutto became this wildly charismatic leader of Pakistan, now Prime Minister. Briefly President and then Prime Minister of Pakistan, who's become this sort of larger-than-life figure among many Pakistani liberals. What people don't talk about so much, as much as they talk about the Zulfikar's sunshine years, of course, is the election of 1977. So, 72, after losing the war, Zulfikar this hero. 77, things didn't go nearly so well. The government took full advantage of its ruling party position to browbeat civil servants and to support the party, to engage in rigging. There were all kinds of sops. Outstanding disaster relief loans were written off. Promises were made for urban improvements. There were all sorts of special concessions made to electoral groups ranging from tanga-walas, horse cart-walas, to Christian sweepers. Lots and lots of things were like this done. Patwaris, local rural tax assessors who'd been fired for corruption, were all brought back so they could help the government rig these elections. But nothing really worked. Zulfikar tried to rein in the press as well. You used to get page after page after page of eulogies for the ruling party, which any dictator would have been proud of. But the Prime Minister used to barely apologize for it. And he won. Much to everyone's surprise, he won. The Pakistan People's Party, the PPP, won 155 seats in all, leaving only 36 to the Pakistan National Alliance, its opposition, one to a party called the Qaid-e-Azam Muslim League, and 8 for independents. Now, the problem was that despite this election, in this rigged election going so nicely Zulfikar's way, just like in the 1970, before the 1970 elections, protests paralyzed the country. Agitation was in the increase in mosques, in bazaars, as urban centers simply disobeyed the franchise. And some of the worst civil disobedience after the 1977 elections occurred in Karachi, where random acts of violence just paralyzed the city's services and economic life, bringing it to a standstill. Ships that came into Karachi port simply couldn't be unloaded, and that just crippled the country's economy. So 1977 elections, the first election had led to the breakup of the country. The next election left it divided and demoralized, ultimately ceding ground to authoritarianism. Of course, General Muhammad Zia-ul Haq would stage a coup against the Prime Minister, and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto would be hanged. So opening it to authoritarianism, but also leaving it wide open for demagogic politics and politicians. So as we sit perched on the edge of another election, it's really important to consider the history. The 1970 elections showed that democracy, far from being a simple cure for all the problems a country has, can end up having some pretty catastrophic consequences if you're not willing to live with its outcomes. And one of those outcomes is going to be that ideas and ideologies you as a ruling establishment may like or not like, the elections may not give you that. Yahya Khan's instincts were in the right place, but at the moment of decision, he stumbled and fell. The 1977 election showed that if you rig the elections, you may get a nice majority, it may look very pretty, but the consequences may be pretty bad. And that's something right now. I'm guessing that various people in Pakistan's military are probably thinking they may get former Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif back again, because his party, in alliance with the PPP, has a nice electoral majority. But if people don't believe those election results are valid, that they're legitimate, they can have some awful consequences. And all of this should make us, I think a little bit about what politicians in our country in the decades after independence brought to the table. They're often criticized for all manner of real and imaginary sins. But the one thing they did do was recognize that India is a diverse country, that you're going to get governments you don't like getting elected, but that you still have to keep forward with pushing democracy and institutionalizing it, because the options, as we'll see from Pakistan, are a divided and fractured polity. India succeeded in stamping out many of the secessionist movements it confronted from the 1950s onwards till the late 1980s. But almost all of those were extinguished, ultimately not because of armed force, but because of political progress. Pakistan couldn't achieve the same. And we started off with a map that showed how divided Pakistan really remains. I told you in 1970, fears mounted in the country about not two Pakistans, but 3, 4, 5 Pakistans. And now, as we look at a country divided by an insurgency in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, by another insurgency in Balochistan, and by this fracturing of the country between parties, it's worth asking the question if the unthinkable lies ahead for our Western neighbor. Thank you again for joining this episode of The Print Explorer. I'll be back with you next weekend.